Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here, and this is Gunnerkrigg Court, Chapter 62, and then Coyote said.
Hello there. So this dead goose in a bush next to a lake, that's something that we saw when we were taking a walk together, and you took a picture. And I was wondering what made you decide to use it in the comic here.
Yeah, so this was actually the corpse of a goose that we found when we were walking around this lake here. And at the time, I was in the process of writing this chapter, and I knew it was going to go on, and I knew that I wanted to bring Coyote into it, and I was looking for a framing device to kind of bring all that together. And when I saw the corpse of the goose in the bush, I just thought it was a really nice kind of striking image, and I wanted to use the imagery of it in the story, and it gave me a good flash of inspiration for this framing device for Coyote here, where he's telling a story of how he pretended to actually be a corpse one time.
It was weirdly beautiful, and I think that you captured it very nicely in your drawing.
I was kind of interested in the notion of Coyote taking great joy in something that is utterly joyless, and it's kind of impossible for anybody to understand quite why Coyote would find any enjoyment in this plan whatsoever. But I think it turned out to be quite an interesting framing device, and it turned into one of the more memorable parts of the story. And it's always funny to just kind of have a peek into the mind of Coyote here, especially when he's tormenting the kids with his strange behavior here. And this just gives an opportunity for Annie and Sengrin to walk off and talk a little bit. Again, since this is all taking place after the plan was executed with Jean, and Annie had a bit of a dressing down from Red in the previous chapter. And this does bring us to another part of the comic that I really enjoy writing and drawing, which is just scenes where Annie and Sengrin are talking to each other. And I guess what I like about these scenes is that it is another look as well into Sengrin's point of view, who I think is kind of an interesting character, because by all rights he should be completely miserable and really a very boring character that probably doesn't have a lot to impart to Annie, who is so very different to him. You know, she is a human girl living in the court, and there's not really anybody else farther removed from Sengrin than that. But as I've tried to show up till now, their relationship is actually very close, and they seem to draw a lot from each other. And even though Sengrin is the older and more experienced of the two really do share a lot and learn from each other in some way. And so in this scene in particular, it's really just Annie kind of looking at Sengrin's motivations and his seeming complacence with just being under the thumb of Coyote the whole time.
Well, it seems to me that when we see Sengrin, it's usually through Annie's eyes, and he seems not happy, but sort of content and wise, but other characters seem to see him as miserable, bitter, crazy, angry, and I guess there is the question of whether he is those things or not.
Yeah, and that is a question that is always up in the air the entire time that Sengrin is in the comic. And the sort of advice that Sengrin does give is, at least I tried to make it advice that you probably wouldn't think of intuitively, but when you think about it and put it into context, it does start to make sense. And I think one of the themes of the advice that Sengrin gives is a certain set of ideas or advice might work for somebody, but not perhaps work for someone else. And so to everyone external of Sengrin, Annie not included, they might see Sengrin from a distance and assume that he is this crazy, old, bitter wolf guy who must be necessarily miserable and upset all the time. But what we see through Annie's eyes is that he has this set of values that he's constructed to recontextualize his life. And a lot of the advice that he has that he imparts on Annie is stuff that Annie actually is able to use as well, such as restructuring how she deals with the anger that is inherent inside her and looking outwardly at the world in a perspective in a way that isn't going to harm her, but it's actually going to help her become more strong. And that has actually been advice that has helped Annie over the course of the comic. And while it is advice as well that Sengrin has taken upon himself, there is obviously a lot more going on there, and he is in a different context than Annie is. So Annie, somebody who has come to trust him a lot, has been able to look at the advice that he's been given, and while other people might look at the figure of Sengrin and say, no, don't listen to anything that this crazy guy is telling you, Annie is able to look past that and take elements of the advice that he's given her over the years and really helped her come into her own, really. And I think that's why I really like writing these two. Sengrin is kind of a sad figure, and while he is helping Annie, and in some way getting help from Annie as well, there is still the lingering reality of just his situation and his reality, and his interaction with the world really is very stunted and strange. So this time that he gets to spend with Annie is almost like the only time that he really gets to be something other than the crazy old wolf that lives in the woods. And with that scene over, we come back to Coyote finishing off his little story here. And the way that this is bookended here, it's a little bit me calling out the fact that Coyote kind of occupying Parley and Smitty a little bit, it was really just a framing device for the structure of the chapter. The kind of morals that he gives at the end are absolutely meaningless and don't pertain to anything. And in a little way, Coyote is helping me out here by keeping these other two characters away from Annie and Isengrin for them to have their own secluded scene together. So my thanks to Coyote for that. And after giving them a couple of gifts, they are sent on their way back to the court. And we see that there's a little bit of, I guess, tension or awkwardness between the three of them since all the stuff that happened with Jean and the other characters at the bottom of the ravine.
So the conversation that's coming up, I remember that some people wondered if you had written it as a direct response to people's reaction to the chapter with Red talking to Annie, but they don't seem to realize that you write these pages like way in advance.
Yeah, that's right. All this stuff was already decided upon before really, any of this stuff with the plan had taken place, because I wanted to explore this side of Annie and the other characters. And I was hoping that this would seem like I was directly replying to the audience, because the whole reason for Red's chapter was to make the audience see things from Red's point of view. And while partially agreeing with her and interpreting the situation differently, I also wanted it to be that people weren't going to agree completely with what Red had told Annie. So I was hoping that the audience's thoughts were in the direction that I've been pushing them. Oh, and just before we get into that, it is always nice to get an update on the stuff that Kat's been working on. And I like working in small elements like this, just to show that the endeavour that Kat is undertaking really is a long-term project that she's been having. But the main meat of the interaction here is Kat, again, recontextualizing the stuff that Red had pointed out. And this is where there are similarities again between Annie and Isengrin. In the same way that somebody might see Isengrin's advice and not really understand where he's coming from, and I think that was a shaky basis for his advice. Red is not super familiar with Annie, not in the same way that the rest of her friends are. And so, from Red's point of view, Annie did act sort of strangely. But in the context of Annie and the rest of her friends who have all been working together on this plan, what they went through was really the best that they could come up with. And so in a similar way, I tried to make it so that people who are not really familiar with Annie might find the way that she acts a little strangely.
So did you dress Annie in blue for this chapter? Because it's kind of Kat's color and they're going to be a little bit more in sync.
Yes and no. The colours for Annie's outfit here are still coordinated with what's going on. Right now, since she's had her hair cut, she tends to wear more blues and subdued colours, which is what she used to wear back in the hospital. But now that she's kind of getting a little bit back on top of things, she has brown trousers on because she was just in the forest. But she still has the blue from her hospital dress on her shirt. But then also it does match with Kat and her surroundings.
And Kat's got brown too there with her apron.
A little bit, yeah. So usually when the two are together in a scene, I try to dress them oppositely, but here their colours are kind of coordinated.
And I also just want to say that I'm glad that Kat stated, you shouldn't feel bad about helping John. It was the right thing, because I think it's important to remember that it wasn't just about something Annie wanted to do. It was about helping someone who was trapped and in pain and so on.
So that's the beginning of Kat breaking this all down. And from Kat's point of view, which I guess is a very mechanical point of view, she gets to the heart of the problem and asks Annie probably the most important thing. She asks, do you regret at all helping John? And ultimately, Annie doesn't. Annie's problem is that the plan may not have gone perfectly, but the end result is that she was able to execute this plan and help somebody who was in pain for a good number of years. And that's what Kat focuses on. And she uses that as the starting off point to break down each of the individual parts of the plan and then look at the areas that Annie might have some problems with. And during the course of the breakdown, she does identify that the stuff that Annie probably is having trouble with is really stuff that Annie could only deal with herself. So Kat does bluntly say that she felt under pressure, for example, when Annie pushed her to developing this arrow device, whereas the way that Red put it, she framed it more in the sense that Annie was forcing Kat to do this thing that she didn't want to do. And that's not really for anybody to decide except for Kat herself. And so she outright says to Annie that it was actually her encouragement, she puts it, rather than forcing, that led her to make new strides in her technology and help her execute the plan in a way that she wasn't even sure she was able to in the first place.
And it's a slippery slope, but sometimes people need a little pressure, Sometimes that's not such a bad thing,
Sure, and that's not always the right thing. For example, it was the psychopomps that pushed Annie into doing this entire plan. And yes, they all were able to accomplish something that they weren't sure of originally, but yeah, I'm sure Annie would have preferred not to have been pressured into this. But as she points out here, there seems to be a bit of similarity between Annie and the other psychopomps.
And here, I guess Annie states for the first time what exactly she agreed to do, which is, she says very casually, but it's kind of chilling.
Yeah, and here we really start to see the problem that Annie has had with the psychopomps this whole time, and why she's tried to keep them at arm's length. And that is that they, over the course of her life, they have been pressuring her to join them, really. And now with this one favor that they have done with her, she's pretty much set herself on a course where she is going to have to join them eventually.
Would you say that's how all psychopomps start? Like they were people who were asked, or animals, I guess, who were asked to join and agreed to?
I guess this is sort of behind the scenes lore stuff, so I don't mind talking about that kind of thing. But the way I'd figure with the creatures that become or are the psychopomps, it's a case-by-case basis, but yeah, I can absolutely see that some members of the psychopomp ranks were people who used to be human and then pressured into the job, but then also there are some creatures who have just always existed and always were psychopomps and were, I guess, designed as nothing else. And so this is just one instance of the psychopomps hoping to expand their ranks by, I guess, pressuring a young girl into it.
But as Kat points out, there might be something particularly special about Annie that makes them so eager to get her.
That's right, and that is another long-running thread to the entire story. And so after that we do take a little break to see that Kat has not only taken the arrow and put it in suspension, but she also talks directly about how the research and the work that Diego had done has pushed her to new developments in her technology. And just as a small note, Kat mentions that a tool is only as dangerous as the person using it, which I guess kind of fits in with the advice that's being given. It's how you use the device that you've been given that determines whether or not it's good for you. And we just conclude on some emotional validation, but also with the understanding that Annie has to work out some things on her own and then go off and have dinner with her crummy dad. And we end off the chapter here with a couple familiar faces making themselves known to Kat. And this bonus page, I was actually kind of stuck what to do originally.
And then I remembered that Coyote had mentioned his lonely goose wife, so I suggested maybe check up on what she's up to.
And that gave me a good way to just tie up all the loose ends here. And thus end the chapter. So come back again for chapter 63, The Shadow Men.
Bye!